confused. Be live now. We're up again. We're up again! Hello! Is it working again? Oh god. I am so sorry. Apparently my internet just... It didn't want to. It just decided to commit suicide for a minute. Or it was YouTube scuff. One or the other. Let me just really quickly retweet all out these links. Oh no. What even just happened? Internet died. That's under so much pressure. I've not had this level of technical difficulty before. Panic. Internet died a moment. New stream. Still book. Fantasy book. Good read times. Good reading times. And now you get to... yes. Perfect. Tweet. And now you get to... Can't believe it. Stream died. New... Oh, right. Oh. Hello. Welcome back. After all the scuffy scuff. Nah. Hopefully this stream doesn't die. But we're okay. We're back. Let me just again. Let me just put this in the chat so if anyone wants to buy the book, they can. Pin. Right. Hello everyone. This is Brandy Rose Smith. Coming to you live from the Forbidden Library. Yeah. Forbidden Library. Oh, yes. Heard in the BG. I'm not sure what you mean. Right. Yes, we were gonna read. Let's do this. Let's pretend that first stream never happened. We're gonna do a big redo. Yes, we were gonna read. Background music. Yes, there is background music. I hope it's not too loud. I made it a little quiet. We're going to be reading Bone, Stone, and Wood. Oh, that's what you mean. Oh shit, I know why I couldn't hear that. Why I couldn't. Oh, sorry. Oh lordy, I'm having a good time. It's a good stream. Thank you for telling me that, though. I'm gonna actually put my headphones on. Like, I know I should have them anyway, because... I don't know. Run! Wind that back! We're going to be reading Bone, Stone, and Wood. Book 1, Exordium, by Blake R. Wolf, who I have followed on the TikToks. And he successfully sold me his book via his TikToks. So I got in contact and asked him permission to read his book on stream, and here we are. He was very, very kind and gave me permission to read the whole book. The whole book! So we're going to be having multiple streams on this bad boy. It'd be great. I am looking forward to it. It's like D&D inspired and has potentially a talking horse with its own character arc. I don't know whether I get confused sometimes with words. Some of his other books, because he's got like 3 series. It's crazy. It's a lot going on. A lot to publish. But let's get into this bad boy. Into chapter 1. Let me know if the font is too small or if you prefer different colors and things like that. We've got like a nice dyslexia friendly font going on. And I like the sepia or the blue personally, but we're going to stick with the sepia for now. I feel like that's easier for people. Here we go. Chapter 1. Year 1712. Post-dissemination. Pulling himself to the top of the rocky cliff, the man stopped to lean against a solitary tree, pulling the water skin from his pack and taking a long drink. Sweat gathering on his brow as he whipped it away. At least he'd found the entrance to the hollow. Fair enough. Hopefully it should be big enough for you. He glanced back down the cliff, paranoid that someone was following, or that he'd be attacked by someone hiding in the mountain forest near the ancient city's secret entrance. Hunger and struggle had driven him to the forbidden ruins, and that no others would dare enter. Driven into forbidden rooms that no others would dare enter. Rumours of undiscovered riches that lay just inside had circled through the small town he called home. If they were true, they would finally free him of the life of poverty he'd always known. Besides, there was nothing left to do, nothing left to go home to. The ruins were his last hope. Metal and other minerals were rare in the outskirts of the kingdom, thanks to the king's never-ending crusades and outfitting his hordes of soldiers. Most of the ancient cities above ground had been picked clean, but the underground ruins had been left mostly untouched. And for good reason, the world below was teeming with danger. A massive set of interconnected tunnels, caverns and roadways, known as the Hollow, made it easy to travel for both of the scourgers and the monsters that called that deep place home. But the man didn't care. He was tired of starving half to death, never making enough coin for a full meal, and sleeping on the rotting rags that stank of mould. The struggle of everyday life was enough to drive him mad, and so he'd made up his mind at last to do something about it, once and for all. A few days' journey had found him at the entrance of a long-forgotten city, where the plains and mountains met. It was hidden amongst the trees and rocks, then up a sheer cliff face. The cave was nearly impossible to spot, but he'd been determined and continued his search. Eventually, he was able to locate it high up in the cliff on the western side of the mountain, with a single tree growing near its entrance. Such as the sun was setting, he stepped into the cavern. Just as the sun was setting, he stepped into the cavern, finding the hidden arch within it. To his surprise, he found the ruins mostly abandoned as he travelled deeper within. He'd heard so many stories of monsters lurking within that he never expected to make it through the first hour. But he did. He'd taken his time, sifting through the ancient bodies crumbling to dust inside the ruined city, taking the most valuable bits off their persons, knowing he could come back for the rest later. As he delved further, he left marks behind, pointing the way back through the maze of tunnels. After a few hours of exploring, he came across a strange room at the end of a curving hallway. The air was damp, filled with hazy light, and a carved hole in the ceiling let a single shaft of sunlight, illuminating a shallow pool in the middle of the room. In the center grew a small tree, no more than a sapling, its roots winding around a crystalline structure like an island, peppered with moss and light lichen. A few lily pads floated on the surface of the water, and their pink flowers in full bloom, the sweet smell of nectar filling the cavern. The air was fresher, and the man breathed in hungrily. A silvery flash caught the man's eye. Something seemed to be sticking out of the crystal stone island, an unnatural shape, coated in a thick layer of moss. Confident that he was still safe and alone, he kicked off his boots and waded into the water. Without a second thought, heading for the small tree at the center, ripping the lilies aside as he went. The water rose nearly to his chest by the time he reached the crystal, soaking his clothing and making him shiver. He clambered up the stone moss tearing off in large chunks as he struggled to get a good grip. With one hand gripping the sapling, he pulled himself the rest of the way up to get a better look. At the top of the crystal was a small metallic cylinder, no thicker than his wrist and less than 2 feet long. 1 second, there. Resting inside a perfectly carved nook. It was almost as if the crystal had grown around it. He pushed away the moss, revealing strange shapes and runes carved across its surface. The markings held no meaning to him, but he knew they were ancient. To his surprise, the metal was untarnished, without a speck of rust or decay, and it shone brilliantly in the sunlight. The shimmering surface of the cylinder made his heart race. Although he'd never seen platinum in person, he knew that's what he must be judging. That's what it must be, judging by its lack of tarnish and radiant brilliance, even deep underground. It was surely worth more money than he'd seen in his entire life. Enough to live happily for the rest of his days and then some. He tore it from the stonel. Then the delicate crystalline points glowing around its base, snapping as he wrenched it from the cylinder. Wrenched the cylinder free! Leaning back, he held it up to the sunlight, admiring the shimmer of the platinum and imagining what his life was going to be like. From that day forward, endless days of luxury, women, and food awaited him as soon as he found a buyer. Maybe even the king himself would be interested, All he had to do was get back to the surface. It wouldn't take long. A bone-like snap echoed around the cavern as the sapling in his hand suddenly lost all its tension. With no chance to react, he fell backwards, splashing loudly into the pool below. I should look up some sound effects so I can use them. When he broke the surface, gasping for air, he could still hear the echoes of the water in the distance reverberating off the cavern walls. With the cylinder still clutched tightly in his hand, he trudged to the end of the pool and flopped on the ground, cold water streaming from his hair and clothes. Peeling off his clothing, he wrung them out the best he could, shivering in the cold underground air. Knowing they would never dry in the cave, he pulled them back on and tucked the cylinder into his pack. The path to the surface would only take a couple of hours if he followed his trail. Once he was outside, he'd stop and dry himself properly in the summer sun. With his boots he'd left on the shore being the only dry thing he left, he set off into the ruins once more, looking for the markers he'd left behind to guide his way, the used torch back in his hand. He'd grown accustomed to the dark, and as he ventured further, he felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Goosebumps erupted around his body as the feeling of being watched washed over him. The torch had grown low and began to sputter as he looked around for any signs of movement, stopping in his tracks. He reached into his pack and produced his last remaining torch. To his dismay, the other went out with a small pop before he could light it. Trying not to panic, he reached into his bag for his flint, having only his sense of touch to guide him in the overwhelming darkness. He found it at last, and with a few strikes of the stone, the new torch burst into life. The flames slowly grew larger to illuminate the oppressive darkness. What? That's okay. If this is a reading stream, then lurking is definitely not a bad thing. I'll just read you your bedtime story. The flames slowly grew larger to illuminate the oppressive darkness, but somehow it seemed to have lost its previous brightness. He held it up, turning on the spot to search for the source of his anxiety. But there was nothing to be seen. Still, unconvinced he was alone, he kept the torch held high and doubled his pace, trying to get out of the ruins as fast as possible. 10 minutes later, he found himself lost in the darkness, unable to find his next marker. Turning around several times, without finding anything familiar, he felt the panic rise up in his chest. He'd clearly marked the path with small piles of stones easily seen in the middle of the tunnel. However, none had come across his sight. Almost like they'd been removed. Even in the dark, he would have been likely to tip them over, but there was nothing. The cavern itself looked vaguely familiar, but he couldn't be sure since every stone looked nearly the same. Had he turned the wrong direction without noticing? The first marker had been easy to find, but none had shown up after it. By his recollection, he should have come across 3 already, before taking a set of stairs upwards. Breathing deeply, he tried to calm himself. Thankfully, the torch was far from going out. However, the feeling of being watched was steadily growing stronger, until his skin was crawling, as if covered in thousands of tiny beetles. Blech. I don't like that image. We don't like... No. Gross. Every few moments, he scratched at himself unconsciously, trying to rub the feeling away. He had to find a way out soon if he wanted to stay sane. A low, rasping breath sounded behind him. It's like he's playing Phasmophobia. Causing him to startle and nearly drop his torch. Spinning on his heel, he saw only darkness. But as his eyes focused in the gloom, he saw something else that caused terror to streak through his body. A pair of deep blue eyes, glowing eyes without irises, floated in the dark a few feet away. As they looked up at him, they flashed, glowing bright enough to show the faint outline of a gaunt face with sunken hollows for eyes. Before he could react, the creature took a step forward into the torchlight. Its form was skeletal and rotten. Dry skin stretched across its bones like the head of a drum. Mushrooms, moss and lichen grew across its form, spreading onto the long rusted armor that still clung to its disintegrating leather strips. The joints ground together under the skin, and the bones rattled against one another. It was a Draugr of the underworld, something he'd only heard about in campfire horror stories, something that was supposed to be purely mythical. And I'm gonna take a drink. Oh, drop my glasses. Oh, sorry about that. Oh, I bet that water went down the wrong way. Good so far. We got a bit of dungeon crawling. We've got a potentially cursed item and a drug yet. Well, this is the start of Skyrim all over again. Thief! The Draugr hissed slowly, stretching the word out as it took another step. The man was too stunned to speak. The class cannot leave the city. It creaked, the mandible barely moving, nearly frozen in place by time and rot. What are you talking about? The man stuttered back, the torch shaking in his grasp. What? Whatever it is, you can have it! The Draugr drew a sword from its decaying belt, the blade rusty and chipped, giving it an almost serrated edge. It pointed the weapon at the man, no sign of emotion crossing its rotting face. Death is the price for thievery from the one and true God. Before he had a chance to move, the Draugr struck out, the blade catching the man across the shoulder. Yelping in pain, he dropped the torch. The sword tore through the cloth and flesh, severing the muscle that held up his arm. The torch clattered to the ground, rolled across the stone floor, and doused itself in the puddle that had formed under one of the ceiling's slow drips. The cavern went dark in an instant. But it wasn't just darkness it was the kind of all-consuming nothing that can only be felt deep underground, where the eyes no longer function and the air seems as thick as water. There the man stood, trembling and groping at his useless bleeding arm, drowning in his own fear. The hot wetness on his sleeve told him he'd been cut deeply. Without any light, he had no idea how bad it might be, since his senses were no longer working, and the fear was consuming his entire being. He looked around wildly, trying to find any hints of the Draugr, yet his eyes weren't accustomed to the pitch black surrounding him. A raspy laugh echoed off the walls, filling the tunnel and his ears to the brim. Wah-ha-ha-ha-ha-ha. The earth thirsts for your blood, the rattling voice said. The thief turned on the spot towards the voice, as his gaze fell on the dark blue crackling energy of the creature's eyes glowing in the dark, inches away from his own. He barely had time to suck a breath before he felt a searing pain in his stomach, as if he were being torn in half. Then there was nothing. Everything below his ribs suddenly went numb. He found himself being held up by the monster, his legs no longer responding to his commands. He thought of the cylinder in his pack, and all plans he had to live a good life. The lavish parties, the booze, the food, and the horse. All of it would have been so grand if he'd just made it out of the ruins with his prize. The man's ears perked up to the unexpected sound of music. Like a tavern piano. Good on me for having a piano background music. That's what it sounds like. Totally. The darkness in front of him faded, a warm glow of firelight filling his mind. He clung to it, nearly smelling the roasted meat. The stale stench of ale soaked into the floorboards. Laughter rang through as the scene began to take form. A busty barmaid holding out her hand to him. Maybe he'd have his party after all. One he could stay at for all eternity. Blankly staring into the eyes of the glowing Draugr. Blankly staring into the glowing eyes of the Draugr, his mind gently coaxed him into death. As his final act of mercy, he slowly slipped into permanent darkness from which he would never recover, the music still ringing in his ears. Well, that was a hell of a chapter 1. This is why you don't go adventuring unless you are somewhat qualified, I guess. I guess he was desperate. A little too desperate. Should have just ran off with what he found on the bodies on the way, I guess. Greed, bro. Too much greed. So this is going to be the chapter 2? Yeah! Oh, that's a big time skip. So this is like at least 200 years later. Interesting. Wait, that's not something I wanted to change. We gotta change the chapter. We're on to chapter 2 now. Done. Quick drink. Okay, let's see what happens. See if we actually have any main characters turning up in chapter 2. I want to know who we're following. A swift breeze cut across the sun-drenched plains of as Nox sucked in a deep breath. He could smell the sweetness of the grass going to seed in the midsummer heat, and the wildflowers bursting into bloom. Gold and green streaks waved and flitted, filling the world with the roar of plant leaves rubbing against one another. Sorry. It was deafening and tranquil, all at the same time. The kind of sound a person could get lost in if they just closed their eyes. Nox tilted his head back and did just that, letting the world swallow him for a moment, adrift in the symphony of nature. He wished he could stay out there all day, just taking in the beauty of the world. But he had a job to do, and if he and his bedridden mother wanted to eat again, then he had to do his job. Yes, I totally read that right way on about. Heaving a sigh, he opened his eyes, looking across the jade lowlands at the sea of grass dotted by pockets of forest. On the western edge lay the tail end of the mountain, low and eroded from thousands of years of rain and snow. The mountains were absolutely off limits since he wished to continue living. The home of the Forbidden Ruins. However, in the middle of a large forest to the southwest was what looked to be a tall tree soaring above the rest. But he knew better. It was a vine-coated tower and his destination. It stretched above the surrounding trees, most of the stone having crumbled away long ago, only to be replaced by plant life. Nox set his sight on it, tapped the butts of his spear a couple times on the ground, and headed in its direction. We have a polearm user. It's a lagoon. Under the dilapidated tower was a series of ruins strewn through the trees. They were nothing but crumbling stone and plants, worthless to him. Below the ruins was a maze of ancient dungeons. He delved into them on a few occasions, and now this is an adventurer with some experience. He's gone to his home and done his home dungeons. He has some XP. Usually coming back with enough scrap metal to garner a few coins. Usually he could stretch the meagre income to feed himself and his mother for a month, or more, but sometimes she needed medicine, so they came up short. The past month had been one of those times. The doctor was never cheap. Nox didn't hold it against her, though. She made herself guilty enough without any help. And if he was being honest, he liked getting away from the slums and out on his own for a little while. Even though it was a dangerous and dirty way to live, scrounging had kept them alive so far. Many times he'd thought about heading off into the wilderness in search of a place to call his own, finding a place where he and his mother could live off the land, away from the city. But, like everywhere else in Licorice, life was scarce, and the wilderness was dangerous. Wild game was a rare sight in the Jade Lowlands, and the forests themselves provided little nourishment. There were animals somewhere, he was sure, but they knew to avoid the plains and woods near the city of Kald. Many of the people in the city, like Nox, were desperate for food and coin, trapped. Sorry, I hadn't quite finished coughing apparently from when that water went down the wrong way. But I didn't want to blow your ears out, so I had to mute from it. I care. I care for your hearing. Killing anything that got trapped, or killing anything that got too close as fast as they could. In the past couple of years, the largest creature Nox had seen in town was a rat, and they often ended up skewered and roasted for a passerby. It's like when they roast the crickets. I can't remember what country does that. Where they roast the crickets that appear on their farmland, cover them in sugar and stuff. Crunchy. In his opinion, they weren't too bad for a quick meal, but he hated picking the little bones clean. But he was too poor to be that particular, so rats it was! The walk to the ruins took little more than an hour from his hilltop. Inside the trees, the wind was muted and the sounds of the grass died away. It was almost unsettlingly quiet with no animals about. But over the years, Nox had grown used to it, and even came to enjoy the silence. Now and again, the cry of a bird would draw his attention upwards, and very rarely he'd catch a flash of blue or red as they darted between the branches. The trees themselves grew tall and imposing, some of their trunks wider than his arms outstretched. Outstretched arms, even! The canopy high overhead was dense, blocking out all traces of sunlight. As he walked through, his footsteps silenced by the thick layer of mulch on the ground. He caught sight of broken stones swallowed up by roots. Eventually, they shifted from errant stones to broken walls. Archers. I thought archers then. Oh no, it was being attacked. No. Crumbling structures indicated he was entering the outskirts of the ruins. When the canopy finally began to open up, he knew he was near the center. Glancing upward, the sky was pierced by a tall tower, with sunlight spilling across a wide clearing. The tower itself was covered in thick vines and sun-drenched leaves, curling up the Loading. Ability to read. Finish loading. Oh no! Apparently that did a thing. Please ignore. We don't want localhost. Oh well. The tower itself was covered in thick vines and sun-drenched leaves, curling up towards the sky in search of more root holds that had long crumbled away. He assumed the plants were the only things still holding the ancient structure upright. He was thankful it hadn't yet fallen, since the base of it held the entrance to the dungeons and his current income. Pushing his way through the underbush and that clustered in the sunlight, Nox made his way across the clearing to the base of the tower. The wooden door had long since disintegrated, leaving behind nothing but worthless rusted scraps of metal that had nearly turned to dust thanks to the rain and snow. As he passed through the arched doorway, he glanced up at the ceiling, covered in vines. It hadn't changed since his last trip. There a few weeks ago. He pulled his threadbare pack off his back, reached inside, producing a small torch. A few flicks of his flint set it alight, and he shouldered the pack once more, ready to fill it with as much as he could carry. Taking a deep breath, he stumbled down the stairs and into the darkness, using his spear to keep his balance on the deteriorating stone steps. Ah, spear and walking stick. Convenient. He hoped his secret cache still lay in wait for him. His mother's cough had yet to subside, and he was depending on it for her medicine. The depths of the ruins hadn't changed much since his last visit. Although he found a few more places where stones had tumbled inwards, breaking off the ceiling or walls, rooms passed by him on either side, filled with the sound of soft drips from the ceiling. It had been nearly 1,000 years since people lived within the ruins before the decimation. What type of people? He wasn't sure, but a few clues remained behind. The tower stood atop a series of holding cells and barracks, their iron bars corroding away, and only a few traces of the beds left within them. Storage areas with broken clay pots, and a single large room that looked to be a kitchen proved that people had actually lived there at one point. What remained behind gave him the impression of a small city or outpost, but little could be gleaned beyond that. Most everything had been lost to the slow march of time. Let me just beep 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 beep. Just move some stuff. The stories of the decimation were rampant and horrifying, each more fantastical than the last. But it was clear whoever had died in that tower had done so while fighting. Armour and weapons nearly always accompanied the bones Knox found, and the bodies tended to be clumped together as if they were piled up. It was obvious there had been some sort of battle, but whoever had attacked the tower didn't stay behind to loot or claim it. But that was all the better for Knox. He needed the metal to sell back in town. Places like this tower were becoming harder and harder to find, while the demand for metal was greater than ever. Scavengers, I am saying that right, aren't I? Scavengers, like himself, made a living delving into dangerous places and bringing back what they found. The king's holy knights were always willing to pay a handsome price to forge more swords and armour for their crusades. A loud squeak caused Knox to startle, yelping as if he'd been bitten and nearly dropped his torch. The sound of many tiny feet hopping through shallow puddles echoed across the walls. "Yeah, you better run," Knox called down the tunnel at the mangy rats. "A little slower next time and you'll be lunch. Little bastards." He took a deep breath and started again. Just thinking about the knights and their blood-red capes put Knox on edge. He never sold to them directly, only to people in town who gave him less than a fair price. But they wouldn't run him through if he looked at them the wrong way. The knights and their leaders were always looking for new ways to make an example of their power, and scourgers were a popular target. Many believed that no normal person could survive the ruins and deep forests because of the monsters that supposedly inhabited them. At least not without the use of magic, which was strictly forbidden by the king and the Church of Relia. As such, scavengers were often killed by holy knights, accused of being heathens and traitors towards the king and his god. It was a strange dance. The knights killed the people they relied on for supplies. The scavengers, with no other way to make a living, continued to delve and risk their lives for people who eventually killed them. Nox adjusted his bandana and walked forward, the torch spluttering in the dark. Scrounging was an easy way to make a living, and it attracted a lot of younger people like himself who were alone or had a great need with no other options. A pack full of metal could bring in enough money to live for a month, or more at a time depending on what was found. While others toiled to grow grain or sell bread every day, he was free to care for his mother outside of the watchful eye of the guards, living off his latest haul from the ruins. Granted, he could be killed at any moment by an unseen monster lurking in the shadows, but that didn't bother him much. He'd rather face a monster than the knights any day. Plus, the rewards posted by the Holy Knights for ancient magical items. Oh, lordy! No, that's my internet history! It's not actually that interesting. Oh, good lord. Accidentally slipped on a button on my mouse that I shouldn't. Oh well. You saw a little bit of my interest history. Good thing it's all nice stuff, huh? I was trying to go back here, because I thought Plus there were the rewards posted by the Holy Knights for ancient magical items. The payout for the tiniest hint of magic would be enough to set him and his mother up for life. But the chances of finding such a thing were more than slim. After all, most of the ruins had been picked over for centuries. Most of the time, it seemed like all that was left was scraps. As Nox turned a corner into the furthest back room, he stopped, his heart sinking. The orange light flickered across a plain stone floor, littered with debris and stone. The small pile of armor he'd stored away on his last trip was gone. Come on. There's a lot of swearing. Fuck me, he sighed, letting his shoulders droop. That had been the last of what the tower had to offer. For the past year, he'd been coming there, slowly cleaning the place out room by room without anyone noticing. But now, it was empty. Someone else had come in his absence and taken the final bits of armor that remained. That meant the other local scavengers were pushing further into the Jade Lowlands, their old haunts running dry. Just like everywhere else in the world, resources were becoming harder to find and people were getting more desperate by the day. And now, they trespassed on his territory, taking his payday so that he'd so carefully gathered and hidden away for a rainy day. He cursed the scavengers under his breath. But he knew deep down He would have done the same thing in their place. Pile of metal was impossible to ignore, and no scoundrel in their right mind would have passed it up. So that person died, and then we're here 200 years later, and there's this guy called Nox who's been going into this dungeon to try and get metal to sell so that he can afford to support him and his sick mother. He has just gone to the back where he stored a load of metal that he was going to come back for, only to find it is gone. Someone else nicked it, and he is now sad. But he's also understanding because he would have done exactly the same if he saw a pile of metal. Kicking up one of the loose stones, Nox turned back to the hallway, dragging his feet as he wound his way back through the tunnels and up into the open air. He no longer had a choice. He'd have to find a new place to search, and all of them were many times more dangerous than the tower. Besides, his mother needed medicine, and it would take every last copper he had to get it before he set out again. Oh! We're already on chapter 3! So we have our main character, Nox, who is a good boy who just wants to look after his mumsy, but is doing that by going into dangerous dungeons. But he seems to be a lot more experienced than the first guy who just got shanked by a Draugia right at the start. So we'll see if he survives his next bout. Not that he had a bout in that chapter. Nox pushed his way through the creaking door, tapping the mud off his boots on the threshold. "Mum, I'm home," he called. "I wondered where you'd gotten off to," she replied from another room. I was worried about you." "Sorry. It took a bit longer than expected," Nox replied, shutting the door behind him and leaning his spear against the wall. She sounded as if she was in good spirits, which is always a good sign for her ailment. "How did it..." Oh! Her words were cut off by the sounds of coughing. Nox felt his heart drop slightly. She sounded worse than when he'd left. Pulling the small glass bottle out of his pack, he went over to a small barrel full of water and dipped the cup in, filling it halfway. He took both into the only other room there was. The only other room where her bed was. Inside, he found the curtain to the tiny window open, showcasing the wall of the next door building, only a few feet away. It was the only window they had, but it let in a small amount of sunlight. His mother was sitting up in bed, the ratty and patched blankets pulled up around her. Her dark hair was streaked with grey, and though she looked healthy enough, he knew how skinny she'd grown over the past year with her illness. He sat down on the edge of the bed, holding the cup between his knees. He pulled the stopper from the medicine bottle. Hey, take it easy," he said, patting her on her leg, as she coughed into her handkerchief. "The doctor said this will help get that to go away." "Oh, you got another bottle?" she gasped between breaths. "Where did you get the money?" "That's not for you to worry about," he replied casually, pouring a few drops of the strong-smelling medicine into the cup and holding out for her. "Drink this, it'll help." She took a deep breath and drained the cup, grimacing at the taste. The smell was bad enough, and Nox could Only imagine how bad it tasted. But it helped, and that's what was important. She handed the cup back to him, coughing a few more times. She took the cup and the medicine. He took the cup and the medicine back to the main room, putting them aside. Leaning against the counter, he took a deep breath. Coming home was always difficult. Every time he left, he somehow convinced himself she'd get better while he was gone. But when he came back through the door, she looked skinnier, paler, and even more frail than ever. None of the doctors knew what was wrong with her, but it was clear she wasn't getting better. Knox wiped the corner of his eyes, where a tear had begun to form. One second, sorry, my light up mouse pad was freaking out for a minute. No! What is going on? Let's unplug you. Let's unplug you, dear mouse mat. You are distracting me. I am reading. Knox wiped the corner of his eye where a tear had begun to form. There was no time for that. Grabbing a handkerchief, he went back to her room, where she settled down a bit. Her handkerchief. He handed her the new cloth, taking the old one away. It was covered in blood. Ah, no, I don't want a new tab. Stupid hotkeys. He handed her the new cloth, taking the old one away. It was covered in blood, just like last time. That wasn't a good sign. Did Abby stop by while I was gone? He asked, trying to ignore the blood. Oh, that girl is so sweet, his mother replied, looking up at him. She was here twice a day the entire time. More than once she stayed a while to keep me company. She let a sly grin creep across her lips, and Knox knew what was coming. You know, if you gave up... Oh, gotta do some smiles for this. No. If you gave up scavenging, you could marry that girl. She paused a moment. The two of you would make a great team. She's just a friend, Knox said for the 1000th time. Believe me, she can do a lot better than me anyway. She deserves better. You're quite the provider, and handsome to boot. Knox rolled his eyes at her. She couldn't ask for more, not in the slums at least. Shh, it's a bit of a backhanded compliment, isn't it? Knox eyed her disdainfully. Well, it's good to know I'm the only catch in the worst place in town. You know what? That's not what I meant. Knox smiled, leaning down to kiss the back of her hand. I know you didn't. But she's too nice to you. Someone has to keep you on your toes. What a thing to say to a woman that spends all day in bed. She laughed, her eyes crinkling at the edges. But you know, she continued in a more serious tone, I really would like you to have someone before I'm gone. Knox turned away from her, walking to the window. He hated it when she talked like that. I know it upsets you, but I'm not going to be around forever. It would be great if you settled down with someone nice. Someone who would take care of you. I don't want to talk about this. Knox grumbled, leaning against the wall. It doesn't have to be Abby. Although I really like her. Maybe there's someone else out there for you. You're getting to that age where you should be thinking about settling down, not diving into ancient ruins. She paused for a moment. Are there any scavengers out there you like? Scavengers out there you like? Scavengers out there? I really don't know how to say. How? Someone you work with? You know I work alone. She sighed. You don't make it easy, you know. Knox replied, turning around. If I meet someone, I'll be sure to bring them home. But it's just not important to me right now. I've got other things to worry about. You mean me? That's not what I said. Am I keeping you from living your life? Mum, come on. Well, if I wasn't sick, you wouldn't have to worry about me. You could go out and date some nice girl. Knox scoffed. Oh boy! I really don't care which. And worry about your own life. She gazed up at him, a sad look in her eyes. I want you to live your life for you, not for me. Promise me you'll do that when I'm gone. I'm getting really tired of this. Nox Vitalis, she said, suddenly serious. Promise me! Fine, yeah, sure, I promise. Good. She nodded, pulling her handkerchief up to cough again. Knox came back to her side, pushing her hair aside and kissing her on the forehead after she'd calmed back down. Don't worry. You're gonna be okay, I promise. Just give me a little more time. He paused a moment, watching the expression of pity on his mother's face. Before she could do anything more, he continued, Listen, I need to go back out for a little while. I'll bring home some dinner, all right? Don't worry about me. I'm not hungry. Well, you have to eat whether you like it or not, Knox replied with a smile. Who's the parent here? She grinned, lifting an eyebrow in his direction. We can talk about labels later. For now, you need some rest. She nodded and snuggled down into her blankets. Knox helped her get tucked in before he stood up to leave. Keep your eyes open for a date while you're out. I love this old woman. She called from the bed. Sure thing, he sighed, heading for the front door. He grabbed his spear and a small coin purse, leaving everything else behind. There were only a few coins in the pouch, but it was enough for dinner. He sighed, glancing up at the small box tucked away behind the cupboard. It held his emergency fund, and it wasn't much. But if he could find some work at the tavern, it would be enough to tide them over again until he got paid again. He just hoped it would be enough for Abby to take care of his mother while he was away. To her credit, she never took any money for herself, only enough to make sure his mother was well fed and cared for. Knox made a promise to himself that he would send her home with extra, against her will if necessary, the next time he pulled in Hall. It was the least he could do, especially when Abby had her own family to care for. Pulling the door shut behind him, Knox stepped out into the slums, heading for the tavern on the far side. It was a great place to get information. Being between the slums and the rest of the town, all manner of people came there, giving him a front row seat to the hottest rumours. Maybe, if he was lucky, there would be a bounty posted for some local sucker the guards couldn't catch. One way or another, he had to find a job tonight. The medicine had drained his savings, and jail was what happened to those who couldn't feed themselves or pay their rent on time. That would undoubtedly kill his mother, and that was something he could not stand for, because in chapter 3 we learned that Knox is a very good boy and his mother just wants him to bone, / have a date, / have someone talk after him when she's gone, which is fair. She just wants her boy to be looked after. I get it. Poor lady. She knows she ain't got long. But we have gotten to chapter 4. So I know this text at the bottom is very small. But it says we're about 8% through the book. Yay! So if we end up getting over 10%, then this book will last about 10 streams. But we shall see how far we get. I'm going to take a very small break, I think, just to rest my voice ever so slightly before we start the next chapter. BRB! Ah, that feels bad. Oh, why am I crying? I'd obviously pressed some buttons and made myself cry. But, oh no. Yes. I didn't say this is going to be not gruesome, at least. He did describe it as maybe no more gruesome than Lord of the Rings. Though I haven't read Lord of the Rings, there is definitely some people who lend some hands in that one. Anyway, my voice feels a little bit, my throat feels a little bit better after that small break. Because these streams are kind of hard. It's like, the gaming streams I can at least shut up for 5 minutes. But these reading streams are constant talking. Which I will get used to. But I don't want to lose my voice, so I gotta take some breaks every so often. However, what job is Nox gonna find for the evening? In the tavern, where D&D parties are likely to meet up, so we may have some more fun characters in the next chapter. I actually don't know, because I will reiterate, I actually have not read this book. I do not know what happens. So, I hope we find the party. I hope this is a very typical party meetups time, and he takes on a job with some colourful characters, and we go on wackadoodle adventures. Let's go! The tavern was more crowded than usual, as Nox sat by himself, slowly working his way through a simple meal of bread and cheese. It wasn't much, but with his reserves quickly running out, it was all he could afford. He'd pressed himself into the back corner, keeping as far... He is the sinister character in the corner of the tavern. He is the plot. He's the plot hook for the rest of the D&D party. Let's see if it pans out that way. Far away from the other patrons as possible. Scroungers weren't always the most welcome of people inside the city proper. Something he'd learned the hard way more than once. He shifted his bandana nervously, making sure it was still covering his ears and keeping his eyes cast downwards. Thankfully, the bustle kept the attention of the customers elsewhere, and he was able to settle back and listen to the din as he continued to eat, hoping for a bit of information that would solve his problems. I heard the king's having a right bit of trouble with them orcs up the north. A dwarven man slobbered ale down his chin and beard as he waved the tankard dangerously. Them's nasty business, mark my words. They'll kill ye as soon as they look at ye. Why, I heard they've been killing children and roasting them for sport. My brother's part of the knights, and he told me once that the orc chief tried to kill one of his primes when they were up in the Ten Bear Woods for peace talks. The young human man next to him responded, holding his drink close. Kill one of the primes? The dwarven man scoffed. Impossible. There's the business. Nobody can harm them. The man lowered his voice. Apparently, he said the orc chief had an enchanted axe. That's the most ridiculous thing you said yet, boy. The dwarven man laughed, slopping his drink all over the bar floor. That is how good alcohol there, sir. Be careful. A great buffoon of an orc with a magic weapon. Several of the customers turned to look as the word left his lips. What kind of fairy tale is this? Next, I suppose you'll be telling me he made it himself. Are you calling my brother a liar? The man asked, the sudden anger clear in his voice. I ain't saying no such thing, the drunk man replied, holding his hands up. Just that it's very unlikely he got the truth from someone else. You know how those soldiers like to tell tales. Why, one of them would see a sheep in a field, and by the next day the whole camp would be talking about how they fought a dragon. The dwarf jerked his drink backwards with a grand gesture to show just how big those tales were. sloshing it over 3 of the other customers, who cried out in surprise. Immediately, they jumped from their seats, turning to face the drunkard, their voices raised. Bar fight, bar fight, bar fight, bar fight. Knox watched as in a matter of seconds the dwarf was lifted from his seat, carried across the room, and tossed clean out the front entrance of the tavern into the cobblestone streets. No bar fight for us. The younger human stood up, puffing his chest out at the customers as if ready to fight. In a flash, the barkeep came around, ushering people back to their seats and trying to keep a full-on brawl from breaking out. Yeah, fair. I guess he wants to, protect his business and whatnot. He refilled tankards with a clay pitcher, assuaging them with the power of the bitter drink that did nothing but dull their senses. Knox took a sip of his own as he watched, hoping it would do the same for him. Catching the barkeep's eye, Knox gestured him over to refill. He slid a coin towards the man, keeping quiet as the tankard was topped off. Are there any bounties posted? Knox asked quietly. The barkeep took the coin, pulling the pitcher back. Nope, he replied simply with a tone of irritation. Without another word, he disappeared back into the crowd. Keeping his head down, Knox continued to listen to those around him. He'd hoped for at least some hint of work, but it seemed like Carl was running dry, just like the scourging spots nearby. It's been too dry this summer. I don't know if the corn is going to make it, an older human man murmured. It's already past midsummer, and it's nowhere near knee-height yet. Yet more bad news for the citizens of drink. Loading. Yet more bad news for the denizens of Kald. That fucking bitch tried to sell me a 12-year-old horse, claiming it was only 6. A porty man in his middle years scoffed a few tables over. Can you believe that? What is the world coming to when you can't even trust your neighbours? Knox shifted his attention away from the farmers. He didn't care about horses or corn. Neither of them would keep him fed or make his mother well. I mean, the corn will. What do you think you're eating? You're eating bread and cheese. Anyway, all the nearby ruins seem to be picked clean. I can't find the tiniest bit of scrap in any of our old places. Knox zeroed on a young dwarven man sitting at a nearby table. His companions leaned close. A human woman with one side of her head shaved and long black hair over the other shoulder, cocked her head to the side, listening to him speak. The other, a thin elven man with richly tanned skin and braided blonde hair, cradled his tankard, looking at the other two with a bemused look. Ah, we have found the D&D party! Knox was surprised to see the elf out in the open without any attempt to hide his features. The man must have been very brave or extremely foolish not to hide his race. Usually they were the first taken by the Holy Knights, or the first executed for suspicions of arcane dabbling. everyone knew elves were naturally gifted in magic. "Then we go to the Forbidden Ruins," the blonde man replied casually. "We can't do that. That's a suicide mission," the woman said in a neutral tone. "That place is connected to the Hollow. Anything could be in there. Not to mention whatever beasts are stalking the mountain forests. We'll be dead before we find the entrance." "Are you two able to get jobs? Start a farm? You have coin for that?" the elven man asked. He patiently waited for a moment, giving them a chance to respond. They did not. "Then I suggest we find a new place to scourge. The Forbidden Ruins are the closest and guaranteed to hold some sort of bounty. We probably won't have to go much further than the front door to make a payday. If you want to try for a normal life after that, be my guest. The child isn't exactly clamouring for labourers these days." It's risky," the dwarf exhaled. "So is breathing, but you can still do that. Besides, we can risk our lives in there, or starve to death here. Pick your poison." Yes, I mean, they're normally pretty stuck up in whatever fiction you read at the very least. They have "I am older and better than you" complexes in almost every fictional realm, like the humans being assholes to everything they find. Ah, fantasy. "What do we do about the monsters?" the woman asked, her gaze fixed on the elf. "None of us are great fighters. If we run into something down there, we'll be dead for sure." Nox felt his chest tighten. He was a practiced fighter with his spear, and confident in his abilities. Delving into the Forbidden Ruins alone would be the end of him. But maybe if he could make himself look useful, he could convince them to bring him along. Yes. He stuffed the last bit of bread into his mouth and drained his tankard. Pushing the seat back, he headed for the nearby table. Just as he did, a flash of bright red caught his attention and he glanced up. A hush fell over the room as a tall man in polished armour stepped through the front door of the tavern, a blood-red cloak trailing behind him. Oh no. I do look forward to that, the prequel series that they're doing for the Witcher stuff, about the elves and things. I look forward to that. Be interesting to learn a bit more about, because they haven't really come up too much in the actual main series, because they're mostly just dead. Probably because they were assholes, but I will be curious to find out more about them. Pushing the seat back, he headed for the nearby He was flanked by two guardsmen, not as finely armoured or dressed, but still armed nonetheless. Nox sank back down into his seat, slowly keeping his head down. With his eyes fixed on the man, he was scarcely able to draw breath. It was Captain Ragvir, a ranking member of the Holy Knights and leader of the local guard. He stood tall and proud, an unfeeling smirk permanently affixed to his face, and his beady, judging eyes glancing over the tavern. His jaw was hard-lined, and his hair was shorn close to his head. The polished, ornate armour framed his face and shoulders, creating an imposing figure that struck fear into the hearts of all of Cald. Of all in Cald. It was enough fine steel to feed Nox and his mother for more than a year. The captain was responsible for enforcing, judging, and punishing all who found themselves on the wrong side of the law. Oh no! It's the po-po. Nox knew from personal experience that Captain Ragvir took great pleasure in carrying out his executions himself, whether his victim was guilty or not. He was more than happy to make an example of anyone who thought otherwise. As you were. The captain barked to the room. The noise returned to the tavern, but at a much lower level than before. The captain's eyes scanned over the crowd, not taking notice of Nox and settling on the barkeep at last. His armour clanged together as he walked across the ale-soaked floor, using the distraction to his advantage. Nox slipped out of his seat as nonchalantly as possible and made his way out of the tavern while keeping to the far wall. He passed by the group of scroungers, all looking at the guards with wary eyes, but still clutching their tankards. Outside the tavern, Nox found himself able to breathe once more in the open air. His head was reeling as flashes of pain and anger broke through his racing thoughts. Being near the captain brought back many painful memories, ones he never wanted to revisit again. He could feel the deep pulse of anger in his chest, his gripping tightness on his spear. The fury threatened to consume him. Taking a few deep breaths, he let it pass like he always did. So many people from the slums, some which Nox had once been friends with, had been tortured to death in the town square for all to see. Most of them had been brought in for simple acts of thievery to stay alive, but by the time the captain was done with them, they'd confessed to being dabblers in the arcane, just to finally feel the merciful release of death. Grim, bro. Watching Abby's younger brother being murdered had been the worst of all. He'd been only 10 years old. That didn't stop the captain from chopping off his fingers one by one until the boy passed out. The captain being on that side of town could only mean one thing. He was running short on victims. Nox shook his head to clear his thoughts and walked across the street. There he found a shadowy corner of a building to take refuge in, so not as to be noticed. Leaning against the closed shop in the dark, he waited for the other scroungers to leave the tavern. Nobody seemed to realize he was there, which was to his liking. Patrolling guards passed by, hardly looking at anything as unusual. The guards rarely intervened with anything unless they saw a chance to prosper. Most of them would be starving on the streets if not for their connections that got them into the city guard in the first place. Nobody in the slums ever made it into a position like that. It was reserved for the moderately wealthy only. After all, from what Nox could see, those in power tended to keep it one way or another. Nox didn't have to wait long. The entire tavern started to clear out, like it usually did when the captain showed his face anywhere. After about 10 minutes, the trio he'd been eavesdropping on exited and turned immediately left, heading towards the slums on the west side of town, where all the scroungers and their other impoverished people lived. Still keeping to the shadows, Knox followed them, knowing they might be his only chance to fill his pockets once more. The building slowly began to shift as he crept along, keeping a healthy distance between himself and the small group. What had been well-built homes and businesses slowly became a bustling shanty town of haphazardly constructed abodes leaning against one another at odd angles. The streets thinned and buildings bent inwards, blocking out the sky. Canopies and clothing lines stretched between the homes, giving the entire city a closed-off feeling, almost like being inside. Torches burned in the rusted and crumbling brackets, blackening the sides of the houses with soot. Only a few small businesses had lanterns out front. Those were always snuffed out and brought inside for the night, so that they didn't go missing. The streets were dirty and pockmarked with puddles of piss and refused giving the air a harsh acidy smell. Acidy smell, that's what it means. That kept most from the eastern side of Cald away. Knox felt the tension in his shoulders ease as he continued, feeling more at ease among the ramshackle garbage than he did in the tavern. The slums of Cald had been his home for many years, and although the streets could be dangerous, it was where he felt most at peace. Soldiers and guards hardly ever visited that part of the city, and Knox had carved out his own little space among the rest of the forgotten. It was the only place he felt like he really belonged. It was home. Ahead, the trio turned into an alley, suddenly rousing him from his thoughts. Putting on a burst of speed so not to lose them, he rounded the corner. Before his eyes could adjust to the dim light, he felt a blade rested upon his throat, and stopped dead in his tracks. The human woman held her sword aloft, the tip of it resting against his neck, his throat. Her black hair spilling across her face, the other two stood by, both with their weapons drawn. "Why are you following us?" she asked in a flat tone. "You have 10 seconds to explain before I spill your blood across the street and leave your body for the rats to feast on like the garbage you are." "Yes, Mummy." "Poetic," Knox replied with a grin pulled at his lips. He knew he couldn't show any fear if he wanted to be taken seriously in the slums. "I heard your loud friend here say that you were considering going to the Forbidden Ruins," he said, gesturing to the elven man. "Sounded like you could use some extra muscle." You think you're qualified for that?" the dwarf scoffed. "You look pretty stringy to me." "That I am." Knox ducked away from the blade and, in a flash, thrust his spear forward, nicking the edge of the dwarf's ear, a drop of blood welling up on the metal. "But I'm fast, and I can fight." The dwarf's eyes grew big as he stared down at the shaft of the spear. Cold steel pressed against Knox's neck from both sides, but the others didn't dare cut him. Oh, 1 second. Slowly, a smile crept across the dwarf's face. "I'd say you make a good argument." The dwarf nodded to his companions, and their blades fell away. You're right. We could use someone like you on our little adventure, on this little adventure of ours. What do you think, Lana? I think he's a fool. She droned, slipping her sword back into the sheath at her side, clearly bored at the situation hadn't ended in bloodshed. Oh, she is the murder hobo! But a useful fool is better than an ordinary fool, which is all I'd find in this place anyway. Nox pulled the spear away, tapping it to the ground beside him with a cocky grin. And you, Vorin? The elf hummed, looking Nox over. It's risky. But then again, so is our line of work. With the numbers and skill on our side, the chances of survival greatly improve. Improve greatly. It's not like we have much choice otherwise. We need coin. He paused. Besides, I am tired of this town. The faster we have some cash, the faster we can leave. I'll assume that's a yes. The dwarf held out a meaty hand. My name's Jaeger. Oh no. I've been watching too much Attack on Titan. Jaeger is bad. And we'll be honest with you. I think this is a damn idiotic plan. But you're welcome to join us if you like. We'll split everything evenly. Everyone gets their equal share. Good to meet you, he replied, taking his hand. He looked at the other two, nodding to each in turn. I like those terms. And the odds. Besides, like you said, the scavengers don't have much of a choice anymore. He glanced around, seeing the nods of agreement. So, when are we leaving? He's gonna go to that place where the guy died at the start. I hope he is a little bit better at dealing with Draugia. And maybe we'll even find out what that little metal shafty thing the dude found was. Maybe it's magic. Who knows? All I know is I'm running out of water. So I need to take a small break so that I can keep myself hydrated. But we will quickly change my currently reading to chapter 5. And I think we'll call it after that, probably. Well, that depends if it ends on a cliffhanger. But I am really curious to keep going. Don't know about you. We shall carry on in just a moment. I have returned. I have a full bottle of water again. Hydration achieved. And now, we continue with Nox's adventure. Nox paused with his hand held a few inches from the door in the early morning sunlight. He was tired of asking Abby for help all the time, but he knew he didn't have a choice. She was the only person in the slums he could really trust. Taking a deep breath, he rapped his knuckles on the door. A cacophony of shouts sounded from within, mostly children's voices. There was a brief pause before the door cracked open and Nox looked down to see a small pair of eyes looking up at him. "Nox!" the little girl called, throwing the door open. She immediately wrapped her arms around one of his legs, sitting down on top of his foot. "Hi, Kaya." "Kaya, what have I told you about opening the door?" A young woman with light brown hair growled. "You know Dad and I are the only ones allowed to open it." "Oh, sorry, Abby," the girl meowed. "But it's Nox. It's okay to open the door. He's okay to open the door for." "You didn't know it was him," Abby replied with a sigh. She reached down and pulled Kaya off his leg and pushed her back inside. "You go back inside and let us talk." "But Abby..." "Do as I say." Kaya replied, crossing her arms and stomping away. Abby pulled the door shut behind her, stepping out into the street. That girl is going to let in a thief one day, and there'll be nothing left. She shook her head. "What brings you out here this early in the morning?" "I'm leaving again? You just got back." "I didn't find anything on my last trip," Nox sighed. "The place was picked clean. Even the things I'd hidden away were gone." "Where are you headed off now?" "To now." "Believe me, you don't want to know." "That bad, huh?" Abby smirked, but it faded quickly. "You know, you could just get a job here in town. I'm sure Dad can find you something." "Abby, you and I both know that nobody's going to pay me enough to keep Mom alive." He watched as her face fell, her brows pulling together in pity. "If I don't get some cash coming in, she's going to die." "Nox," she said, grabbing his hand. "I know you mean well, but..." "Don't worry," he chuckled, gripping her hand back. "I'll be fine. I always am, right?" "What if you don't come back this time?" "I will. I have to. Mum needs better medicine if she's going to get better." Ugh, Abby groaned. "Nox, I know you aren't that naive." The muscles in his body stiffened. She's not getting any better." "Don't say that," Nox muttered. "I'm not saying it to hurt you, but you're risking your life for no reason." Nox wrenched his hand back away from her and took a step back. "No reason, Abby? Tell me, if your dad was laying in there dying, would you just sit back and do nothing? Would you?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "You know that's not what I meant. But eventually you're going to have to accept the truth." The anger and pity in her voice surprised him. "One of these times you're going to run off and come home to an empty house. How will you feel then, huh?" She punched him in the arm. You big fucking moron. Spend some time with her while you can. Knox could feel the sadness welling up in his chest. He knew Abby was right. But he wasn't about to give up yet. Not yet. Taking a deep breath, he pushed his emotions down, trying to calm himself. Abby, it doesn't matter what the truth is right now, he said, softly pulling a leather pouch from his belt and holding it out to her. This is all we have left. If I don't get some money soon, neither of us will survive starvation. He took a step towards her, putting the pouch in her hand. And you and I both know that nobody in this town is going to hire my kind. My totally not an elf kind. Especially not on the east side where your dad works. Abby sniffled, her jaw set to one side because she wanted to argue, but knew he was right. She'd made that face since they were kids, whenever she'd lost an argument. Fine. I'll look after your mum while you're gone. She held up a finger, pointing it at it in his face. But you hear me, Nox Vitalis. This is the last time. Got it? Yes, ma'am. He replied with a smile, pulling her into a hug. You're the best friend a guy could ask for, Abby. Thank you. She reluctantly hugged him back. I know. Now go get your ancient shit and get back here. Your mother and I are both tired of worrying about you. Nox pulled back. While you're there, can you convince her that you and I aren't getting married? Ugh, she's relentless, isn't she? You can say that again. I'll do my best. She's a hard woman to reckon with, but I suppose if I got myself a nice girlfriend, maybe she'd quit asking. Please do. And quickly. They both laughed and pulled each other into another hug. Take care of yourself, Nox. Don't forget to come back this time. I mean, you didn't forget to come back last time. I think that's just bad phrasing. I was a little confused for a minute there. I won't, he replied. I promise. Hard promise to make, my dude. 2 days of hard journeying on foot from Cald brought Nox and the other three to the valley, the green mountains rising high above. The trees were sparse around the base, but as the hills inched towards the sky, they became heavily forested. Already the eastern side was cast in shadow, the sun dipping behind the mountains as it worked its way towards the horizon in the late afternoon. It was the first time Nox had ever seen them up close. They looked a lot smaller from Cald. Nox breathed, trying not to sound too winded. I suppose the entrance is at the top, of course. Not the peak, but around the western side, Jaeger replied, his hand resting on a tree trunk for support. He was dripping in sweat from the midsummer heat. We should be there by nightfall tomorrow, if we can find it, Boren said, him and Lana both seemingly unfazed by their hustle across the plains. There should be an obvious cave somewhere around here, concealed amongst trees and rocks. Something that's obvious doesn't come pre-concealed. Nox grinned, looking up at Voran. That seems a bit contradictory. We will find it, or we won't, Lana replied flatly. That's the way of it. Knox shook his head, adjusting his bandana. Lana was always so serious. I suppose I can't argue with that. He looked up at the imposing mountain in front of him, the dense forest growing dark in the shadow of it. Do we press on or make camp for the night? The other three seemed to glance at one another, their eyes falling to Jaeger, who was the youngest but had somehow garnered the title of leader. He sighed, his shoulders drooping. Why are all of you looking at me? He asked, shrugging. I'm not the leader. They all stared at him expectantly anyway. Reluctant leader. Fine. We'll make camp here and continue around the mountain in the morning. The last thing I want to do is get lost in the woods at night. Who knows what's prowling around in there after dark. Knox nodded, watching Jaeger roll his eyes as he tossed his bag to the ground. Wood was easy to find just inside the trees, and soon there was a small fire built on the lee side of a boulder to block the wind. Quietly they sat around, chewing on whatever dried meats and stale biscuits they had brought with them. I wonder if they... The writer of this is clearly American, if only because of the mom. So, by stale biscuits, do they mean stale scones? Since that is apparently what an American biscuit is. Question mark, question mark. Knox rolled his bed and lay down, his hands laced behind his head. The sky was crystal clear, and the stars began to pop into existence, breaking through the red sky before the sun had completely set. He watched as the horizon flashed bright golds and pinks, then faded quickly into blues and dull oranges. It wasn't long before it had turned to inky black, and the two moons began to rise from the northern horizon. To his surprise, he saw both of them were full, a rare occurrence that only happened once every few years. He smiled to himself, remembering how his mother always made a point to see the lunar conjunction when she was well. She would stare up at the sky, the larger blue moon and the smaller yellow one reflected in her eyes, and tell him how they symbolized potential and new beginnings. She'd always seemed so full of hope on those nights. He wondered if Abby knew to tell her about it. He stared up at them, wondering if his mother had been telling the truth, or just some fairy tale on those nights. His stomach turned as he thought of her deteriorating condition, and he shifted his eyes away from them. Instead, he focused them towards the stripe of stars that had splashed across the heavens, intermingled with wisps of green and blue. Still, the ache remained in his chest. Closing his eyes, he could hear the other three of his companions talking, but his thoughts were far away. He wanted to join them, but the trip wasn't about making friends. It was about money and the skills needed to do the job. Even if he wanted to enjoy their company, he knew it wasn't his place to get involved. That only led to hardship for those around him. He learned the hard way that his kind wasn't welcome anywhere. Keeping to himself, Knox rolled over, his back towards the fire, and concentrated on clearing his thoughts from his mind. Eventually, without realizing it, he drifted off into sleep, his thoughts blending seamlessly with his dreams. Oh no. Potential dream sequence. The darkness surrounding Knox was complete as he opened his eyes. Out of instinct, he reached up and touched them to make sure they were actually open, unconvinced that any place would be so dark as where he found himself now. For a moment, he began to panic, worrying that he'd somehow gone blind in the night. But then something caught his eye. In the far-off distance, he could see the tiniest pinprick of a light. It was soft and green, like sunlight through leaves on a summer's day. A strange hum filled his ears, like the sound of water pressing in all around him. But there was something else within it, a deep reverberation that seemed to fill his mind, piercing into its depths to get at his thoughts. He forced the feeling away, refocusing on the glowing ball of light no bigger than a distant star. Step by step, he approached it, forcing his oddly heavy legs to move as they fought against him. It felt like he walked for hours. But suddenly he was there, standing a mere foot in front of the glowing orb that was no bigger than a walnut. It pulsated softly, and warmth radiated from it, washing across his body, which he now saw was completely unclothed and completely exposed. Oh dear. But that didn't matter. All his attention was focused on the orb, as he impulsively reached out a hand to touch it. As soon as his finger touched the orb, the green gold light flashed, nearly blinding him. The low hum suddenly grew and wavered, like some alien beast calling him from far away. The sound was so intense, he clasped his hands to his ears, trying to save his senses from the onslaught. In his mind flashed images of caverns, ruins, and loot, all things he'd seen on his expeditions, and as familiar as his own name. But then he saw something else. 3 giant sets of eyes popping into existence, all staring down at him. To his left were intense dark blue eyes with slitted pupils, while the ones to the right were deep brown and calculating. In the center, much larger than the others, were 2 massive black orbs with what looked like stardust and silver smoke strewn across them. Nux felt they were looking into his very soul, judging every piece of his person as they stared down at him. Just as fast as the sound had swelled, it died away, the eyes fading away like ghostly mist caught up in a gust of wind. The orb in front of him pulsed slowly, now permanently producing a tiny version of the sound that had overwhelmed him. He reached out to take it, and watched as it formed a green ring. He stopped midway as a pair of cackling blue lights appeared directly in front of him. Nux watched as several more erupted around him. The sound of low rattling breaths filled the darkness. Before he could react, the velvet black swelled around him, swallowing all light in the space and plunging him into nothing but darkness. Nux awoke with a start, sitting straight up on his bedroll, gasping for air, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced around in the dark grey of early morning, squinting for any signs of glowing blue eyes or rattling breath that had surrounded him only moments before. To his relief, he found no sign of either. "Are you okay?" a sleepy voice asked from nearby. Voran was sitting up on one elbow, looking in his direction, his hair sticking out in odd directions. Bedhead! Yeah. I'm fine, Nux replied. Just a bad dream. You sure? Yeah. Go back to sleep. You'll need it for the climb. Voran nodded and pulled his cloak tight to keep off the early morning chill. He rolled over, turning his back to Nox, pulling his body into the fetal position. The sky was just beginning to lighten as Nox glanced over the camp, but a thick fog hung over the ground, obscuring most of his surroundings. The air was occasionally pierced by the early morning sounds of birds and insects alike, singing in the dawn of a new day. Their sparse songs put him at ease, knowing they would have been silent if there was danger nearby. He laid back down on his bedroll, pulling his cloak over his head like Voran had. Even though it was high summer, a chill still clung to the valley where they had lay, and the moisture in the air only made it more intense. Already pieces of his dream were beginning to fade away. With each breath he drew, another sliver was lost. He remembered the 3 sets of eyes clearly, the rattling breaths of whatever was after him. But the rest came in amorphous and strange. At first he was convinced that dream meant something, that the strange sensations in his body were trying to deliver a message. But after a while he chalked up to just sleeping outside in new surroundings, exposed to the elements, and the fear that dangerous creatures could be upon them at any moment. Although every now and then he strained his ears, he thought he could still hear the low hum of the glowing ring somewhere in the distance. An hour later, when the sun had fully risen, he heard his companions rousing from their sleep at last. At last I had a drink. Good lord, we do. This chapter's a lot bigger than I thought it was going to be. It's definitely the last chapter though. He hadn't been able to fall back asleep. As he rose, he noticed the fog had yet to burn away from the valley, and their cloaks were coated in dew, the wool repelling the majority of it to keep them dry. To warm them up, a small fire was built and a quick breakfast was eaten. When finished, they all stood up, shaking out their cloaks and gathering up their things. They had a long day of searching ahead of them, along with a mountain to climb. With a final nod from Jaeger, they began their long ascent into the mountain forest. And that is not the end of the chapter. Oh, obviously I was like, one more chapter, and then it was like a fat ass chapter. Oh well. More book. Let's go. The trees grew dense as they climbed, slowly working their way around to the western side of the large hill. The large, sharp boulders, as if punched skyward from under the ground, thrust themselves among the tree trunks. Roots and moss spilled across their surface, and on more than one occasion, Nox could see the ghostly shadow of carvings long since eroded away into obscurity. As they came around the western edge, the clouds drifted away, and midday sunlight spilled across them, burning away the last remnants of the mist that clung between the trees. The canopy was thicker on that side, and the undergrowth almost non-existent, making their journey easier. To their right, the ground formed into a sheer cliff covered in lichen and moss. trees forcefully rooting themselves into the gaps between the rocks. Nox lifted his hand to shield his eyes, looking over the rocky surface. "Do we think the entrance could be up there?" he asked, scanning the surface for any kind of cavern. "Bored?" Diego asked, turning to the elf. "Don't look at me," he replied, shaking his head. "The western side of the mountain is all the information I have. It's not a map." "Well, I didn't see it down here," Nox chimed in, looking at the other three. "I suppose we should start climbing then." Lana let out a sigh, but was the first to the cliff, finding a foothold and hoisting herself up. Nox was quick to follow, throwing the leather strap of his spear over his shoulder. The stone was thick with moss and vines, offering soft but treacherous handholds. The three of them each picked a separate starting point, pulling themselves towards rocky outcropping some 50 feet above. Now, no more than 10 feet off the ground, Nox felt the moss suddenly come free from the stone, and he began to fall backwards, grasping for vines, his hand wrapped around one, but it tore away with a snap, leaving him to free fall through the air. With one final thought, he kicked off the wall, flipping backwards in the air, and with grace that astounded even himself. To his surprise, he landed on his feet, hands grasping the earth to stop him from sliding down the hill. The others looked back at him, their expression shifting from concern to surprise. "Well, I ain't seen anything like that before." Jaeger chuckled, leaning away from the stone. "You must be the real deal, kid." "Who are you calling kid? You're barely older than me," Nox replied, quirking an eyebrow in his direction as he stood up, brushing the dirt from his trousers. "But I can handle myself." "Less male bravado and more climbing," Lana quipped, not looking away from the cliff. "We don't have all day." "Yes, ma'am." Nox shook his head and walked back to the wall, clambering up once more. This time he shifted to Lana's path to avoid his previous blunder. Someone rolled a crit fail, but then rolled a crit success to stop it, I guess. Following her lead, he began the climb. 10 sweaty minutes later, they came to the outcropping, plopping down on the mossy rock to catch their breaths. Fox ventured to the far edge of the stone, where it thrust away from the cliff into open air. Leaning against a small tree whose roots clung to the rock, he surveyed their surroundings. From his new vantage point, he could see all of the western Jade lowlands. Stretching out before him, a massive sea of grass shifting in the never-ending winds that swept the plains. Rolling hills dotted with small ponds and lakes, filling the world around him. He knew the sea was out there somewhere, but not within sight. A part of him longed to fly out over the plains and never come back, leaving the world of scrounging behind, and the slums behind for good. But as he dreamed of it, a heaviness settled in his belly like a stone. He knew he couldn't leave. The ramshackle parts of Cald were his home, and his mother needed him. There he could be safe amongst the garbage and the poor, not drawing attention to himself. He didn't belong out there in the wilds. That place was too big for him, and too full of unknown dangers. At least in Cald, he knew what to fear, and could keep a close eye on it. He knew the sooner he was home, with coin in his pocket, the better. Quite a sight, isn't it? Jaeger asked quietly from behind Nox. You haven't heard Jaeger approach. Feels like you can see the whole world from up here. It's beautiful. I hope this crazy escapade works. A good haul could get us all to a better city. Someplace with less rats. Boring, can't stand the sight of them. Jaeger smirked, leaning against the opposite side of the tree and looking over the landscape. Do you ever think about going out there? Seeing what the world has to offer? I think that's still Jaeger talking, actually. Do you ever consider going out there? Seeing what the world has to offer? Nox felt the excitement rise in his chest as he started to answer, but stopped himself. Taking a deep breath, he let it all out. No. With a sigh. No, he replied flatly. I'm happy where I am. The dwarf eyed him suspiciously. Nobody is happy in Cald. He chuckled. I've only been here a few months and I can already see that. Well, I am. I don't need anything else. Jaeger paused, looking in his direction. No offense. No offense meant, guy, he said. I'm not one to tell people how to live or what to do, just making conversation. Nox breathed out, looking back at Jaeger, forcing a smile. I'm not offended. I just know where I need to be. He paused for a moment. But don't think I'll go soft on this trip because of that. I want money just as bad as the rest of you. I need it. Jaeger smiled, reaching up to pat Nox's shoulder. Good. We'll have each other's backs if we're gonna make it out of this alive. Jaeger looked back to the cliff. If we ever find the entrance, that is. If the chapter ever ends, that is. Oh, good God. It's still technically chapter 5. Is chapter 5 just a monstrous beast? Nox's gaze was pulled upwards as he watched a bird swoop downwards towards the cliff at full speed. He flinched a moment, thinking it would crash, but instead of colliding with the stone, it seemed to fly straight through, disappearing from sight. I think I just found it, he said, pointing up at a dark section of the cliff face overgrown with greenery. He stared back at the group, waving the dwarf on. Follow me. There! Oh, that's good. We made it to chapter 6, which is 18% of the way through. So if we keep going at this pace, then this might only last maybe 6 or 7 streams now, actually. But very enjoyable so far. I don't think the penny's quite dropped for it yet. We've got our party, we're starting the adventure, but I feel like it's going to take a couple more chapters before we get to maybe the meat of this book. So far we just have a very good boy, just wants to make his mum better, does not want to accept that she's probably not going to make it even if he manages to get the money. And some side characters which hopefully we'll learn more about later. Yeah, that's official. Well, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you are interested in purchasing this book, I pinned the Amazon link. It is also in the description. You can... I should probably put where you can follow the author. It's at Blaker Wolf. Like I said, he's very, very active on TikTok. I don't know about his Twitter. I found it, but I don't know whether he actually uses it that much. We'll find out. See if he retweets my stream tweet. But, yeah. This has been Perenni Rose Smith, live from the Forbidden Library. My next stream will be Tuesday. Yes, where we will pick a grand company and finally get my chocobo. Mounts, 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 mounts. I am looking forward to it. I hope you look forward to it. But there is in fact only 2 streams next week. My schedule will be in the ending thingamajig, so I'll just shut up here. Oh, actually no, last thing. I will probably put up a small summary blog on my website, so people who want to catch up with each stream can just read that, and then I don't have to explain every time. Or I mean, I can read that blog each time, but at least if... I don't know what I'm saying now. What am I doing? I'm going to bed soon. That's what I'm doing. I'm gonna go die for a little while. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you had fun. Apologies for the scuff at the start. Hopefully, YouTube won't F me over all the time. Anyway, bye!